Welcome to the Holy Post. Pope Francis died on Monday. Will the Catholic Church continue to move in the direction of inclusion and reform, or will it elect a more traditional leader in reaction to the last papacy? Then Mike Cosper is back to talk about his new podcast from CT about the Satanic Panic, Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. In the 1980s and 90s, the FBI investigated over 10,000 reports of satanic ritual abuse, but did not uncover a single credible story. So why were parents throughout the country so worried about heavy metal music, board games, and the Smurfs leading their kids into devil-worshipping cults? Cosper explains how hucksters leveraged fears and cultural change to create mass hysteria, and why lessons from the Satanic Panic are still relevant today. Also this week, medieval art reveals the sounds and smells of hell. On Holy Post Plus this week, we have a ton of new content, including two bonus segments that we couldn't fit into this week's main show. First, Mike Cosper and I talk about some of the lives that were ruined by the hysteria surrounding the Satanic Panic, including teenagers wrongfully accused of murder in Arkansas and daycare workers falsely accused of child abuse in California. Their stories reveal the real cost of believing lies and spreading conspiracy theories. There's also a bonus segment where Phil, Caitlin, and I discuss an article about the impulse to blame our own sins and shortcomings on Satan or spiritual warfare. Of course, we also have all the regular weekly offerings at Holy Post Plus, including Getting Schooled, 66 verses that explain the Bible, and full episodes of the Sky Pod every Friday. And don't forget about our upcoming live event in Detroit on May 3rd with me and journalist Tim Alberta. Those tickets are still available at holypost.com/events. All right, here is episode 666.
Hey there, welcome to the Holy Post Podcast. I'm here with Sky Jitani. Hi, Sky.
Hi, Phil.
Hi, and Caitlin Chess. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Phil.
If you're watching on video, you may notice something different about our set. The lights are red. The background graphics are on fire. What's happening, you ask? Well, if you're not keeping count at home, you may not have noticed this is episode number 666. And the folks here at the Holy Post have a sense of humor. So graphics were changed and lights were reset, and we are simulating the fires of hell.
You don't know
I don't know
that.
how I feel about that.
This could just
Just
be
for you two.
This could just be the Chicago fire.
We're doing a special commemorative episode on the Chicago fire.
Mm-hmm. Or
we're raising money for LA.
Or
oh wow.
Or
we're exaggerating the point that the two of you are going to hell and I get out.
Oh,
I don't like that.
that's harsh. I've never heard Caitlin Chess say anything that harsh.
Really?
In all my days, we're not going to keep it this way the whole episode because, number one, it's a little disturbing. And number two, because somebody online is going to grab a clip and make it look like we're promoting Satanism in some way, shape, or form. And I don't want that. Maybe you would want that if it was your show, but it's my show. Well, it's our show. And I don't want that. So, yeah, and I'm not, says Caitlin.
No one here is promoting Satanism.
Okay, We're not promoting Satanism. We're just having some lighthearted fun at Satan's expense. And now the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Caitlin.
Today's episode is sponsored by Our Place. You're trying to eat healthy, right? Are you trying to cook healthy? I mean, is your cookware part of the problem? Most cookware still contains harmful forever chemicals, where a single scratch on a non-stick coated pan can release 9,000 particles of plastic into your food and into you. Our Place makes high-performance, toxin-free cookware. You can cook without worrying that the coating on your pan is going to end up in you. Plus, the cookware from Our Place is gorgeous. Great design, awesome colors. You've got to check it out. Our Place has a 4-piece cookware set that can overhaul your entire kitchen. The set includes 2 multifunction always pans and 2 perfect pots in mini and full sizes that replace a whole stack of cookware, and buying them together saves you $150. So stop cooking with toxic cookware and upgrade to Our Place today. Visit FromOurPlace.com/HOLYPOST and use code HOLYPOST for 10% off site-wide. With a 100-day risk-free trial and free shipping and returns, you can experience this game-changing cookware with 0 risk. This episode is sponsored by Rocket Money. Hey, if you're like me, you want to use your money to do good in the world, to support causes you really believe in. But by the end of the month, your money's all gone. Maybe it's because, like me, you've got like 50 subscriptions, half of which you don't even remember signing up for. That app for your kids that they used like once, that delivery service, the fitness plan that didn't work out so well. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that finds and cancels your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills and free up money for the things you really care about. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has helped save its members an average of $740 a year with over $500 million in canceled subscriptions. I can see all my subscriptions in one place, and Rocket Money will help me cancel the ones I'm not using with just a few taps. Stop wasting money on things you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/holypost. That's rocketmoney.com/holypost. rocketmoney.com/holypost. And thanks to Rocket Money for sponsoring this episode. And we're back, and we're normal, and we're no longer in the fires of hell. Thank you, everyone. It's going to be okay.
Thank you, Jesus, for saving us.
Thank you, Jesus, for
Happy Easter.
For rising again on Easter every year, like clockwork.
No.
He rises again on Easter. My grandson actually asked me that. Is he going to rise again next Easter? Again? Is he going to rise again next Easter? He's 5.
That's okay.
That's cute.
I said, he's not born every year at Christmas, right? He's like, oh, yeah, it's his birthday. Okay, well, that's what this is. It's his rise again day, like a birthday.
Right.
Yeah, but only a couple people have those rise again days.
But like we're not born every birthday. We're born once and we remember it. Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Thank you. Uh-huh. I'm full of good analogies.
Let's see.
Good job, Phil.
In honor of our 666th episode, we thought, well, first of all, our guest today, Mike Cosper, will be diving into the fun of the 1980s and 90s phenomenon known as the Satanic Panic, which how many of us were alive for? I was. I remember. But do you remember?
Oh, yeah. I remember.
You do?
Oh, yeah.
Because it hit your church, your mother-in-law's church?
All of it.
What? Yeah. What do you mean all of it?
My mom and my mother-in-law went to the same church.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Your mom went to the same. I didn't.
Right.
I didn't realize that. Okay, and that church was concerned in the 90s?
I don't know about the church leadership, but there were definitely parents in the church that were concerned. Yes, in the 80s and somewhat in the 90s, but definitely the 80s.
Yeah. See, I kind of grew up with that fear, that Satan was around every corner because we had the movies, The Thief in the Night, that whole series of movies. Those were played on film in my church. And then we had a traveling evangelist who talked about the evils of satanic rock and roll and asked us to bring our rock and roll albums to the church so that he could break them. And in the pulpit, broke rock and roll albums over his knee.
Isn't that just kind of a copy of the Disco Demolition stuff from the late 70s?
Yeah, but this was before that. So
it was before that.
This was before that.
Yeah. I thought it was like copying that.
This was in Muscatine, where we left in 80. So it was probably 75, 76.
Wow.
Yeah. And he also preached against Ouija boards and had someone bring in a Ouija board that he ripped in half. So it was very dramatic. It was very dramatic because once you've ripped the Ouija board, then Satan can no longer talk through it because the letters don't line up right, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. That seems important.
Okay, other than music and Ouija boards, was there any other paraphernalia that was taboo?
No, because we didn't have much. There wasn't a whole lot of Satanism in Muscatine, Iowa in the 1970s.
I don't think Dungeons and Dragons existed yet.
No, we weren't there yet.
Yeah.
That was 80s, and I remember that. I remember hearing how that was evil.
And video
satanic.
games weren't really a thing yet.
Didn't have video. We had Pong.
Thank God.
We had Pong.
Yeah.
Yeah, I played Pong in the lobby of the Muscatine Hotel for a quarter, and you went boop, 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 back and forth, and that was video games. Boop.
Wow.
That's how old I am, Caitlin.
The very
That's
top of the
old.
slippery slope.
Very top. That was the top. It was the top of the funnel, and the bottom was the open mouth of the devil. And that's where all of the kids went that started playing video games in 1972 when Pong appeared.
Caitlin, being a little bit younger, what's your first memory of like fear of satanic stuff?
I think I've said this on the podcast before, but I feel like I got more of it than my age would normally make you think, because my mom was a missionary kid who grew up in places where that was more front and center.
Yeah.
And so when I was young, my mom was really worried about Halloween or about movies or TV shows that showed, for us, it was more witchcraft that felt like that was being smuggled in lots of TV shows for kids. And we had to be worried about that. But most of my exposure to like real satanic panic, like there are people in satanic cults doing weird things, was in learning evangelical history in seminary, and especially having a lot of friends who were counseling students. And weirdly, at Dallas Seminary, there was a lot of emphasis at the time by some of the professors for our counseling students on counseling people who were victims of satanic cults. And I think the reason there was emphasis on that was just because it was fascinating to the students. And so it like got them really engaged and people would get really kind of obsessed with it. But even that, I think, is a generational thing, because I think most of those professors were old enough that their interest in that comes from a prior
So
era.
wait, remind me, what years were you at Dallas?
I was there from 2016 to 2021.
So that's
20
years after, more than 20 years after the Satanic Panic.
That's fairly recent.
Yeah, it's very recent.
The
Yeah.
victims take a while to come
And
out.
they're actively teaching counseling students how to help people who've come out of satanic cults. Is that what it was?
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. You know what goes with a satanic panic? And it kind of fits. It feels like it's the appropriate thing for episode 666.
I'm thinking of spicy hot wings.
Oh, that's a good idea. No, it's a satanic panic news of the butt.
Oh my gosh.
And now it's time for news of the butt.
It's time for news of the butt. This question recently appeared on Reddit. Can someone please Can someone please explain, Caitlin, stay with me. Stay with me. Can someone please explain why medieval artwork frequently depicts devils or mythical creatures with human faces on their butts? Would you like to see a picture of this, Sky? I can't show it to you.
No.
Like that.
If there's any way to put this up on video, we need to put this up on video.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
That is amazing. To describe it a little bit, it's medieval artwork that you would see in a manuscript or something. But this looks like a centaur, half man, half horse.
And the man half is a medieval minstrel playing the lute.
Right. And looks like Robin Hood.
Yep.
But the rear end of the horse is a human face with a trumpet.
Playing a trumpet.
Yeah.
From the human face on the horse's butt. And then we have a picture of, look, see, here's a kind of a devil or a demon, and he's got a face, and there's flames coming out of his mouth and coming out of the face on his posterior. And look at this one. This one's wild. It's an engraving of kind of a
dragon-looking thing.
A dragon-looking thing, but it has one hoof, on a hoof for one hand, a human hand for the other hand, a human foot for one foot, and like a bird's claw for
Talon,
the other foot. And then it has a man's face on its butt, and then on the end of its tail is a chicken's face. Pretty wild.
It is very wild.
It's some pretty wild stuff. So an art historian responded.
So this was a common thing to put faces on butts of demons.
Why do medieval artwork frequently depict devils or mythical creatures with human faces on their butts? And a medieval art scholar responded and says, I've posted on this topic before, but here's a paraphrase. The faces on the abdomens, groins, buttocks of demons are visual exaggerations of the voraciousness of sin, both in gluttony and in lust. In regards specifically to butts. I should have that on a t-shirt. In regards specifically to butts. ... Dear sir. Medieval Christian tradition emphasizes the word breath of God as the origin of all creation, and likewise the gospel. Consider also the idea of the spirit, from Latin, literally breathe, as in the English word respiration. Conversely, flatulence could be thought of as perverse evil breath. So mouths on butts would make sense for demons. Speaking heretically or perverting God's word would metaphorically be like flatulence out your mouth.
This is actually theologically amazing. No, truly. Yesterday was Easter. And in John's gospel, there's that amazing scene after the resurrection of Jesus appearing to the apostles, and he breathes on them and says, receive the Holy Spirit, which is an allusion back to Genesis when God breathed the breath of life into Adam after forming him from the dust of the earth. The Old Testament says that everything that has breath draws its breath from God. That's all spirit language.
Yes.
So the inverse of that, the perverse,
it's the wrong end.
Inversion of that would be the breath that comes out that's not very
sweet.
Nice. Yeah, out of the other end. So the malicious word of the enemy would come out of the more malicious orifice, if you will.
Is flatulence.
Yeah.
From the butt face.
It is theologically consistent.
Totally. It's totally.
Caitlin, come on.
You get it. You see it, Caitlin.
I do. I mean, I do get it. I do see it.
And how did Martin Luther describe the statements of the Pope? As flatulence.
Really?
Yes. When the Pope would say something, this is after, obviously they broke up. Mm-hmm. after the breakup.
After they broke up.
Every time the Pope issued a new statement, an anti-Reformation statement, Martin Luther would describe it as the Pope has issued another great flatulence.
Well, this is where we get the phrase, he's talking out of his rear end.
Exactly.
He's talking out of his butt.
Caitlin?
I'm torn because I want to say something in contrast to this theologically, but I don't want to contribute positively towards news of the butt.
What are you going to do?
But Augustine has a whole section in City of God where he could have used an editor to get rid of some of this stuff that was just his weird wonderings. But he has a whole section where he talks about people who can make especially loud noises with various parts of their bodies as more evidence of like the wonder of creation. So I don't know. It could be positive or negative.
I'm just going to say he was not speaking with biblical authority when he was saying that. That was just more him having fun. That was him riffing. He's just riffing there.
I'm just saying there's options theologically here for how to think about this.
But at least in the sense that this medieval art historian is describing these images, it makes
sense, Caitlin.
I get it.
Yeah.
Admit it.
Listen,
okay.
I'm all about the theological significance of medieval art.
You don't need, I know you really want to, you do not need to sanctify flatulence.
I don't want to do that.
And this art doesn't do that.
I do not want to do that.
Like it sounds like Augustine is saying it's something great that we should thank God for, but in this medieval art, they're saying the opposite.
No, we don't know. Right. No, we don't like it. We don't like it when you're in a small room with flatulence. We don't like that. That makes us think of Satan, not of God. Okay, while we're on the topic of satanic news of the butt, are you familiar with the work of Hieronymus Bosch?
No.
Hieronymus Bosch was a painter, a medieval painter, actually late. He painted between 1495 and 1505. He painted this amazing triptych. Do you know what a triptych is?
I do know what a triptych is.
It's a three-panel painting. His amazing triptych, and his painting could be a little bizarre and very detailed, like where you just keep looking and you find more characters. It's not like a picture of the mother and the child. Mm-hmm. It's like, this is hell.
I bet I've seen it. I know his stuff.
Yes.
I just didn't know his name.
Okay. The first panel depicts the world before the fall. It's the painting is called The Garden of Earthly Delights. The left panel is the sixth day of creation before original sin brought about the fall. The central panel is humanity reveling in their sins post-fall. And then the third panel is the payment for all of those sins. The third panel is hell.
Oh.
Yes. Well, interestingly, in the third panel, the hell panel, there's all sorts of sinners being punished by strange creatures. And there's musical instruments, including a harp and a lute and a horn and a drum. And they're on top of poor sinners.
Oh.
And out from underneath the lute, you just see the bottom half of one sinner, his butt and his legs sticking out. They're all
of a lute.
From underneath a giant lute.
Oh, he's being crushed by it.
Yeah, see, he's right. See, there's the lute, and there's his butt and his legs.
And what is that?
What is what? He's being crushed
Next to him.
Oh, that's on. Oh, it's a pink frog monster with a very long barbed tongue.
Yeah.
But here's the deal. People have noticed that have looked at this painting very closely that there are musical notes painted on the poor sinner's butt.
Yeah.
Is it a tattoo?
They think it's supposedly written by the long barbed tongue of the pink frog monster.
Okay.
Okay. And so people tried to decode the musical notes on the sinner's butt.
It's Stairway to Heaven, isn't it?
If you play it backwards. It's Stairway to Heaven. No, it's music written tiny little brush strokes, little notes.
Baby Shark.
It's called, it's colloquially called Hieronymus's butt song. That's the colloquial name. But it's the music of hell, according to Hieronymus Bosch.
But can these notes be played?
Yes, in fact, we're going to play them for you.
Oh,
would you like to hear?
All right, that's a long butt cheek.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
That might have gone through the melody a couple of times.
Yeah, okay.
So that is the music of hell, according to Bosch, the painter.
Oh, Bosch. I thought you said Bush.
Bosch.
Okay.
Me too.
Bosch I've heard of.
Hieronymus
Bush? No.
Bosch.
Okay, got it.
Hieronymus.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad my mother didn't name me Hieronymus.
Or erroneous.
Or erroneously name me Hieronymus. Anyway, that's the butt music of Bosch from hell.
Wow.
To go, what better? It made you feel a little uncomfortable, didn't it?
And where was this triptych? Because they're usually like altar paintings.
Yes.
Where is it in Germany? I am assuming somewhere.
Such a good question, Sky.
If we wanted to see this in person.
Always asking questions that I may or may not have the answer to. Where is this? There. I don't know.
I'm always fascinated by what earlier times or other cultures have made visually central to their worship, because a huge triptych depicting the tortures of hell isn't probably what I want to look at all day when I'm praying and singing and worshiping God.
Well, it was a medieval thing.
I know, but even the Sistine Chapel, the whole front is the judgment.
Yeah.
And some of it gets...
I'm into it.
I know you're into it, but it's...
Okay.
It's just interesting. That's all. That someone is like, you know what? We need an art piece for our church.
Yeah.
Let's have the tortures of hell be the front and center.
Okay. This has been the Satanic Panic themed News of the Butt.
This has been the News of the Butt.
Mike, I think we should play the News of the Butt theme backwards. Okay. Now we got to pull it around. A little more serious.
Okay.
Oh, that was pretty serious, but this is more serious.
Yeah, the judgment of hell is pretty serious.
Yeah, okay, that's pretty serious, but this is more serious. The Pope passed away.
Yes.
Like just hours ago. As we're recording, it came out. Oh, wow. Pope died. Didn't see, I mean, we saw that coming, but we didn't see it coming like right now because he was meeting with people yesterday.
It feels like he tried to hang on through Easter, which is admirable.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think so. So Pope Francis died at age 88. He was the first Latin American pope. He was the first Jesuit to ever be pope. Did you know that?
But he chose Francis as his name, which is so interesting.
Because he's not Jesuit?
No, because that's Franciscans, Jesuits.
Different order.
Different orders, and often not in opposition, but very contrasting.
So he went out of order in looking for a name.
Yeah. But it was it's sort of an olive branch to people who may be more critical of him.
Oh, okay. 500 years the Jesuits have been around, and not a single Jesuit has ever been pope, because Jesuits generally don't seek church authority. They consider themselves servants, not leaders. He was the first pope to issue an encyclical about the earth and pursued environmental justice. Okay. He felt that climate change would disproportionately impact the poor. He was the first pope to use the word gay in a public statement. That's interesting.
Oh.
In what language?
He changed the conversation around LGBT people in the church. What?
Well, because he spoke English, Latin, Spanish, Italian. I don't know what is gay in all those different languages, or what language did he use it in?
Happy.
I don't
know. Okay. You're always asking questions that assume I have exhaustive additional information.
You should be flattered.
You should take that as a compliment.
That's right.
But I never do. So you just make me look like I didn't do enough research. On the issue of LGBT people, conservatives, of course, said he went too far. Liberals said he didn't go far enough. He was the first pope to name women into Vatican leadership positions. Again, conservatives said he went too far. Liberals said he didn't go far enough. He spoke out firmly against the anti-immigrant movement in the U.S. He clashed with Trump and publicly corrected Vice President Vance, who was one of the last people he met with. So, was he the woke pope? That's my question. Was he the woke pope? No. And if so, what comes next? Is there a backlash? Because there are a lot of conservative Catholics that do not like him at all.
There are a lot of things I don't know about. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I know very little about is internal Catholic politics.
Well, you ask me about things I don't know about all the time. Well, so I'm returning the favor. Okay, I'll try Caitlin. Let's try Caitlin.
Yes, let's try Caitlin.
Caitlin, do you think, is there the possibility of a backlash in hierarchical Catholicism to, because Pope Francis, I think one of the complaints from some people was that he was so empathetic. Can I even say that some conservatives would accuse him of the sin of being overly empathetic? Like he wanted everyone to be included. He cared more about the marginalized, it seemed sometimes, than he cared about speaking really clearly about doctrine. And it confused people, and sometimes then others around him would have to kind of clean up. Well, that's not what he meant when he said that. What he really meant was this. Do you think there's likely to be a correction or an overcorrection?
Like Sky, I am not an expert in internal Catholic politics, but I have read a lot. I have read a lot of Pope Francis's, of his work. And I do think one thing that's hard for people who are not Catholic, who would just kind of look into this from the outside to understand, is that a lot of things that Pope Francis wrote and said were not new for the Catholic Church. There were things he did that were new or significant, or that he emphasized more than past popes or other leadership had emphasized, including that he did seek some lessening of formality in the Vatican, in part because he took the name of Francis when he became pope, not just to kind of distance himself, like Sky said, from the Jesuit order. His explicit justification for that was that someone whispered to him as the voting was happening, remember the poor. And he wanted to express concern for the poor in the vein of St. Francis. So there were some lessening of formality in the pursuit of not having things be too ornate or elaborate or hierarchical in that sense. But also, so much of the theology was in line with what Catholic social teaching has been saying for a long time. The concern for creation and for environmental issues, he did write about that in significant ways that popes in the past have not. But he's drawing on not just scripture, but on existing Catholic social teaching for making those arguments. And what I think is not only going on is that he was saying things and doing things that were in line with Vatican II, for instance, which was trying to be more exclusive or more inclusive for the Catholic Church. But also some of the conservative backlash to Pope Francis from Americans is in part not just because there's like a conservative wing of the Catholic Church, but because some Catholic churches in America are having a lot of people flock to them that did not grow up Catholic, that maybe don't even know as much about Catholic social teaching historically, but are drawn to a church tradition that to them feels more hierarchical, feels more traditioned, and they're coming from a conservative political position to the Catholic Church, or are being kind of inflamed in some of their more conservative leanings by political things more than theological things. So some of the backlash to him, I don't think is just like he was super left and now there's a conservative like pulling back to where the church had been. Some of the really strong conservative push in American Catholicism is not where the Catholic Church in America has always been. Some of that's a change that's happened in recent years. And what a lot of people outside of Catholicism, myself included, have struggled to understand is how the Catholic Church, in terms of official doctrine on social issues, is really contradictory, not actually theologically contradictory, but if you're trying to fit them into a particular political box, you can't do it. Like there's official Catholic teaching on the rights of labor, and then there's also official Catholic teaching against not just abortion, but birth control. You can't fit that in one side of the political spectrum or the other. And Pope Francis might have emphasized some things that more conservative Catholics might be pushing back against, especially in America. But that doesn't mean that there's like two wings that are on opposite ends. It means that official Catholic teaching is really hard to fit on a political spectrum. And if you're coming to Catholicism from political conservatism, there's going to be things that are not just Pope Francis, but are official Catholic doctrine that are going to bug you.
But didn't he represented more of a Southern Hemisphere view of a lot of social issues, whereas Catholics in the U.S. were much more soaked in culture wars, soaked in even the Cold War. South America didn't really have a horse in the Cold War race. They weren't being threatened with communism, and they weren't holding up, trying to hold up capitalism. So in many ways, he sounds a little more socialist than a Northern Catholic would expect, which is true of much of the Southern Hemisphere's Christianity.
Yeah, but I think that's coming from going back to the person who whispered to him when he was being elected, remember the poor. When you remember, even his writings about environmentalism were really driven by his concern for the poor, that they would be the ones most impacted by this. What he said more recently about migrants and immigrants in the United States, which upset a lot of conservatives, was because he's concerned for the poor. And a lot of that was very much in line with Catholic teaching. Yeah. It just was cutting against the grain of conservatism politically in the United States or in other parts of the world.
So I do wonder, was he, did a larger percentage of American bishops take issue with him than bishops of other continents? Like if we ranked them, European bishops, what percentage were Francis fans and what percentage were detractors? And South American bishops. That would be interesting to know because the Pope has always had kind of a Eurocentric vision. Yeah, because that's where
all popes have been from Europe up to this point. Yeah.
And so
no.
What? No, there's been no pope outside of Europe.
Yeah, the very early popes. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, well, okay, fine. I'm talking about like.
I'm just saying, to be fair to the Catholic Church. Okay, that's true.
All right. Yes, but in what, the last 1,500 years?
I think the last non-European pope died in like 700 or 800.
Okay. I remember that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm older than you are. That was really.
But like
I said at the time, I don't think we'll ever have a non-European pope again in my lifetime. But I was wrong because Francis came along and he was non-European pope in my lifetime.
Okay, then. Here's some of the stuff I've been reading up on him that I think is hard to pin down. Like there's been a Catholic teaching for some time that divorced Catholics who remarry are supposed to be barred from taking communion. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Francis came along and basically said he didn't change that official teaching of the church, but he more or less said, this is really hard to enforce. And let's just have mercy, kind of like we're not going to be screening people. And so his posture was much more of, yeah, this is the official teaching, but pastorally, practically, we need to be more gracious,
right?
And more, and even his posture towards sexual minorities and others who have been ostracized or demonized in certain communities, like his posture was much more merciful. Yeah. Without actually changing official Catholic teaching. So there's a little bit for everybody to be upset with there.
Right.
Because the progressives want to go, well, why aren't you changing official Catholic doctrine on X, Y, or Z? And then conservatives are saying, no, that's official Christian teaching or Catholic teaching. You shouldn't be more inclusive or merciful on these things. You should draw a hard line.
Why are you muddying the waters?
Exactly. And so he was really good at complicating things, and it upset everybody.
Cool. So what's your prediction?
I have no prediction.
What's your prediction? Do you think we in a couple of months we'll come back and revisit our predictions and see who was closer? Do you think it will be, wow, he was really refreshing. People were really inspired by him. Let's try to keep that spirit alive. Or, wow, there was a lot of infighting over his confusing statements and we really need to kind of nail down the edges of the fence. Let's pull back a little bit.
Two predictions, just because of what we see in politics generally is people tend to react to the previous thing. So I could see a pope coming in who's somewhat of a reaction to the Francis years.
So that's your prediction.
My real prediction is it's just going to be an old man. I feel safe on that one.
Yeah, that's really not the question I was asking, but that's okay. Caitlin, what's your prediction? Sky says probably a reaction. Back.
I don't have a prediction, but I do think two other things that are important to say are, one, the other thing about Pope Francis is not just kind of, like Sky's been talking about, statements that were less precise. It's also really important that his predecessor was so much more of an academic than he was. So that's an interesting thing to pay attention to, too, in terms of who the new Pope is not just where they fall on kind of an ideological spectrum, but what is the bulk of their work. Like, I think one great benefit of Pope Francis was a lot of his background, not just coming from a different geographical location and experiencing things differently, but having a different kind of vocational background. I mean, part of this is the Jesuit difference, but Jesuits are known for being like super academic. So it's also strange that he was not as academic as his predecessor, who gave much more precise academic kinds of statements. The other thing I think is important for us to know in this conversation, as Sky and I have said, is not only like a reminder that there are chunks of the church that like we know a lot. If we're talking about like what the Southern Baptist or the PCA or whatever is going through, there are huge chunks of the church outside of American evangelicalism that have all of their own complicated histories. The Catholic Church, among the greatest of complicated histories, that just, it's helpful to remember how broad and varied and diverse Christianity is, and that just because you have experience of your own very particular tradition does not make you an authority on all sorts of other traditions.
Yeah.
That also applies geographically. Yeah. Like, we can make our best guess on like how we experience Catholicism in America. The great gift of the Catholic Church, the thing that I think Protestants should be jealous of Catholicism of, even though we have theological differences where we're thankful for our distinctives, one area that we can be jealous of them in is how truly global their tradition is, and how much that global nature ends up working out in terms of these kinds of conversations. One great gift that Pope Francis gave the Catholic Church is an emphasis on synods and having kind of collaboration and input and open dialogue about theological questions at more local levels, and having bishops come together and talk about things and not just have his decision be what mattered. There's a great benefit to that also makes it really hard for Americans who are not Catholic to know much about what's going to happen, because our read on American Catholicism is a small slice of what actually happens with the Catholic Church.
And that's why I'm so curious. I'm so curious about, will it be an uprising globally of, we want to continue the spirit of St. Francis? Or is there a louder voice that says he was a little too loose around the borders? We need to tighten down the borders. Because it's happening in politics a lot around the world, where things are swinging to the right, largely driven by immigration, which Pope Francis was definitely a pro-immigrant pope. That's interesting. Yes?
One other thing I just want to say, if you're listening to this and you're like, I don't know a lot about Catholicism, I don't know a lot about Pope Francis, Phil mentioned at the beginning his like first official writing from the Pope about environmental issues. Laudato Si, that really important encyclical that he wrote about environmentalism, is beautiful and rich theology, and it's super short and it's very accessible because it's intended to be for the education of lay people. So I would just recommend, if you're like, how should I be thinking about what's going on? You could get into all the politics of how the next Pope will be elected. That could be interesting. Or you could read a really rich, beautiful piece of theology that Pope Francis gave us.
Or you could go watch Conclave so you'd know exactly.
I'm going to do that too.
Yeah.
So.
I am in for it. Like, not the movie, but I remember when Francis was picked and like, they had nonstop coverage on the cable news stations. And what I loved about it was this tradition of the Catholic Church doesn't give a rip about television sponsorship. Like, like we have to cut for commercial and they're like, we're still going. Like, and just the smoke, the white smoke, the black smoke.
There's good drama.
It's good drama. Like, it's so refreshing that there's still an institution that doesn't bend to the whims of social media and modern media culture and all that. And they just say, this is how we do it. This is how we're going to do it. And I think that's fascinating. And it's only a handful of times in my life that it's happened. Last time was really strange because, of course, the Pope didn't die. He voluntarily stepped down, which was crazy. So, yeah, it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks.
Yeah. And there has been a movement of intellectual conversions to Catholicism, particularly in the U.S. with folks like J.D. Vance and others that are drawn to, we want clear teaching. You know, we like teaching that never changes. And a lot of those guys weren't wild about Pope Francis. So it will be interesting if the man chosen, I'm pretty sure it's going to be a man, chosen next...
confident.
Sounds like Pope Francis. It will be interesting to see if some of those more recent converts say, they go Mel Gibson and they build their own Catholic churches on their properties so they can do it the way you're supposed to do it and kind of ignore the Pope. That'll be interesting. Okay, well, I had one more story. We ran out of time. So, and it's also back on the Satan topic. And if you're a Holy Post Plus subscriber, you can check out the last story that I wanted to talk about, but we ran out of time. And we'll see you next week.
The Holy Post is sponsored by BetterHelp. We are living in crazy times, and that can be hard on your mental health. Plus, relationship stress, parenting, marriage, and work stress, it all adds up. Well, don't try to handle all this on your own. You can get help from trained professionals. But the economy and tariffs and the price of eggs, adding therapy onto all that feels like a huge investment, and the cost of traditional in-person therapy can be huge, costing anywhere from $100 to $250 per session. Online therapy with BetterHelp can save you, on average, up to 50% for each session. BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform, having served more than 5 million people around the world. It's easy, too. You can join a session with the click of a button to help fit therapy into your busy life. And you can switch therapists at any time. You can do better than just survive these crazy times. Your well-being is worth it. Visit BetterHelp.com/HolyPost today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/HolyPost. Today's episode is sponsored by Policy Genius. Life insurance is one of those things that's kind of boring, but really important. I have a lot of people in my life that count on me, and I want to know they'll be okay if I'm not here. So, I need life insurance. Policy Genius is a marketplace that will help you find and buy life insurance. With Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per year for $1 million of coverage. Some options are 100% online and let you avoid unnecessary medical exams. You can compare quotes from America's top insurers side by side for free with no hidden fees. And their support team will answer your questions, handle paperwork, and help you through the whole process. Join thousands of happy Policy Genius customers who've left 5-star reviews on Google and Trustpilot. Secure your families tomorrow so you have peace of mind today. Head to policygenius.com/HolyPost or click the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. That's policygenius.com/HolyPost.
In 2021, Mike Cosper had a huge hit with his CT podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. That show looked at how common evangelical values like church growth and celebrity pastors can become toxic and do incredible damage. Well, Cosper is back with a new podcast that again looks at the shadow side of the American evangelical subculture, with Devil and the Deep Blue Sea examining the Satanic Panic from the 1980s and 90s. I'm old enough to remember the paranoia around secret messages in rock music and Saturday morning cartoons, but my conversation with Mike is more than a history lesson or a nostalgic stroll through our childhood memories. He says the fears and grifters that fueled the Satanic Panic are still at work today. We see it in the political idolatry, conspiracy theories, and demonization of minorities that remain all too common in some parts of the American church today. Mike Cosper is the Senior Director of CT Media and the author of several books, including The Church in Dark Times and Land of My Sojourn. Here is my conversation with Mike Cosper.
Mike Cosper, welcome back to the Holy Post.
I am always happy to be here.
Delighted. And you're on our special episode. I don't know if you know this, but this is episode 666.
It's perfect.
It's perfect. That's why we wanted you for this. First off, just congratulations on the new series, Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. I can't imagine how much work you put into these series, given the writing, the production, the interviews. So it must feel good to finally have it out in front of the world.
Yeah, it really does. And we've got 3 episodes left. We have an episode dropping Monday, which I am chained to my desk getting finished. And that's how these things go. And I love it. I wouldn't have it any other way.
All right. Well, carving out time for this is appreciated all the more. Everyone knows Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, massively successful show. I think part of the reason it was so successful, I know you've probably analyzed this to death, is it wasn't about Mark Driscoll or even Mars Hill. It's that it resonated with the experiences so many other people had in unhealthy, toxic churches with bad leadership cultures and things. And so they resonated with it. Coming out of that, what made you want to tackle the topic of the Satanic Panic? And did you have in mind a similar kind of connection that people are going to relate to this because of their own experiences in some way? Why was this the next thing you tackled?
What I pitched to my executive producer at CT was this idea that I wanted to start a series where we could, season by season, tell different stories and help Christians kind of think about the challenges. At the heart, I think, of all of this is the question of what would it look like to be thoughtfully and faithfully a Christian in the midst of whatever moment we might be living through. And in many ways, we haven't even gotten to that question in the season because we've just done so much kind of storytelling and explaining what's going on. So that's the premise behind the series, The Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. And each season, we're going to tell different stories. We'll pick a story, we'll pick an idea, and go into depth on it. I think the parallels with Mars Hill is, one of them, frankly, is just this idea that I've kind of become obsessed with, which is evangelical culture is weird. Like we get into weird stuff, we do weird things, but because we all do them together, while holding hands and praying together, like we think that's normal. Yeah, and we treat it as normal.
I had when I was on staff at my church, there was a good friend of mine who was an elder at the time, and he gave me a mug that had one of those despair.com inspirational thing, and it was a group of hands all together, and it just said, "None of us is as dumb as all of us." And that's sort of how it feels sometimes. Like if any one person was involved in some of these things, you'd be like, that's really dumb. But when the entire evangelical American subculture gets involved in something, somehow it feels okay or normal.
Right. No, that's exactly right. Like we, it's the story in particular that we're telling with this series is really a story of mass hysteria.
Right.
And it built over, if you want to understand where it came from, it builds over time. It starts with real anxieties and real fears and real, there was stuff happening in our culture in the 1960s and 1970s that paved the way for this. That was disturbing, that was problematic, that was deeply concerning. And then there were, 2 or 3 sort of well, there was more than 2 or 3, but there were a number of what we might call hucksters, and who then show up and kind of capitalize on the anxiety, and then I think where we're at in the series, we're about to get into the point in the story where I would argue the hucksterism joins forces with kind of a culture war mentality. And there's a sort of marriage of convenience there.
Okay. I want to get to that in a minute, especially the hucksters and the culture war stuff. Before that, I have no doubt that there are people listening to this who are not as gray-haired or bald as you and I are, that have no living memory of the 80s and 90s.
I have hair. It's gray, but I still have my hair.
I cut my losses. That's fine.
It's one of the few things I got going for me.
I'm just saying there are people who don't have a living memory of what we're talking about. So if you're talking to somebody, I don't know, a 20, 25-year-old today, and they ask you, hey, Mike, what was the Satanic Panic?
Yeah.
What's your quick elevator pitch kind of response to that?
Yeah, so the Satanic Panic it starts around 1981. It basically ends in 1993, 1994, maybe.
I didn't know you had such definitive dates on this. Okay.
Well, I put the dates around it for basically 2 ideas. One was a book called Michelle Remembers that came out and just sort of rocked everything culturally. And Michelle Remembers was a book written by a psychiatrist named Lawrence Pasder about his patient, Michelle Smith, who through a series of what was essentially hypnotic regression, though they didn't want to, he pretended it was not hypnotic regression, but it was very much hypnotic regression. They, quote unquote, recover all these memories of her as a child being subjected to satanic ritual abuse. And it sets off this firestorm in 2 ways. One is an anxiety that there's a Satanist living next door to everyone. And 2 is the phenomena of recovered memory. And this idea that through therapy, through therapeutic techniques, that in hindsight, people look at these now and they look at these therapeutic techniques and they say these are highly coercive techniques. You could recover memories of things that happened as a child that were traumatic, but you've forgotten them. And so what happens then from there is, the stat I always cite is that between 1981 and 1993, there were 12,000 accusations of satanic ritual abuse that were documented by the FBI. Of that 12,000, 11,000 of them resulted in investigations. And of those 11,000 investigations, they did not find one, not a single one, where actual cult activity was connected to any of the abuses that were accused.
Well, that devil's very tricky. He hides.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean that's of course, yeah. If you're the true believer, your response is, well, of course they weren't able to find the cults,
Okay, but going back to the definition then, 1981 to 1993, which is interesting because that is my childhood. I graduated from high school in 1994, so that is my overlap is perfect there. What's your basic definition to explain to somebody when they ask what is the Satanic Panic? How would you summarize it?
Right. I mean, I would summarize it as it was the belief that there was a cabal of Satanists that was international, underground, deeply networked and connected with one another, that were conspiring together to abuse children, get them hooked on drugs, use them for pornographic purposes. I mean, in cases like there's lots of these stories of like impregnate them and then take their children or their fetuses and sacrifice them to say, like, the stories get really wild and crazy. But all of that, like that core idea of there's a national network, an international network of Satanists that are doing these things and they're working in schools and daycares and churches and different places. It took hold in a profound way, and it was taken very, very seriously. And you can go back and you can look at the news. I mean, lots of daytime talk show was covering this stuff, but so was CNN, so was 60 Minutes, so was, respectable stuff on, PBS, the New York Times, Washington Post.
As I recall,
they really believed it was happening.
It was just kind of assumed that, there are Satanists and they are up to no good and they're doing awful things. The scale might be debated, but nobody was really questioning whether or not it was real.
Right.
All right. So here's my.
Here's the other thing that I always say, real quick. The other thing I always say is that if you were a child of the 80s, and you were an evangelical child of the 80s in particular, your mom was nervous about everything from the Smurfs to the Magic 8 Ball to Dungeons and Dragons to the Gummy Bears TV show on Saturday mornings. Like anything that had anything to do with magic, there was this anxiety, there was this paranoia that this stuff was gonna seep in, get under your subconscious, and essentially the entertainment itself was going to groom you to get you ready. So when the cabal came knocking at the door, you were ready to, sign up or whatever.
Okay, so that's a perfect segue because my first living memory of the Satanic Panic was sitting in the backseat of my mom's car, and she was in the driveway of a friend's house, kids that we often played with, and their mom was sitting in the passenger seat of my mom's car. And they put in an audio tape of some preacher, I don't know who it was at the time. And I remember listening to it and the two of them pausing it every once in a while to debrief what they were hearing. And it was this whole thing about how there were hidden messages in rock and roll music, especially heavy metal music, that were satanic and were implanting subliminal messages in the minds of teenagers. You talk about that in one of your episodes. It's known as backmasking. Explain that whole element, the music, rock and roll piece of the Satanic Panic.
So a lot of this goes back to the 1960s, and really the whole anxiety of the panic goes back to the 1960s because there were so many kind of seismic shifts, not just in culture, but really even in just sort of understanding of human consciousness. A lot changes then. Psychiatry goes mainstream. LSD changes a lot the way people think about things. We have a whole episode where we go into kind of what happened with the Manson family and how much that kind of changed the zeitgeist for really to make parents paranoid that oh my gosh, my kid takes LSD, they're going to become a mass murderer. There was something to that. I mean, that's part of this that I we're trying to take seriously here is people did join the Manson family. People did join Jonestown. But anyway, backmasking, it's a technique that it's a recording technique that was developed in the 1960s, kind of explodes. I think the Beatles are the first major act that ever did anything with it. And then seconds after that album comes out, everybody's rushing to the studio to figure out how do we play with this, just because it was just an interesting set of sounds. What comes later, much later, is all this fear about, well, what is this doing to our minds and our heads, right? Because the backmasking itself wasn't sort of reacted to as evil until you had this other undercurrent really taking hold, which was that the idea of subliminal messaging, the idea that there were ways in which pop culture could get into the subconscious and turn you into something else. So yeah, they took a lot of time, a lot of energy was spent, listening to. I mean, the most famous incidents that were sort of referenced were always Led Zeppelin, and the idea was that Led Zeppelin, and look, Led Zeppelin loved Jimmy Page especially. He loved pagan imagery. He loved. He was a big fan of Aleister Crowley. He bought Aleister Crowley's estate when they were at their pinnacle. Who played around with black magic and tarot and all this kind of weird stuff. Yeah,
I mean, that's an element here that I don't want to dismiss. There were a lot of heavy metal bands that did like to play up satanic imagery, whether it's pentagrams or weird goat-headed figures or whatever. And then you add into that this backmasking and this fear of subliminal messages, and you can see why a suburban mom in 1983, freaks out about it.
And that's where I think there's an Occam's razor element of this that evangelicals missed altogether. certainly by 1983, there were a lot of bands that were playing with satanic imagery, but they weren't doing it with backmasking. They weren't doing it subliminally. It was literally on the album cover.
Exactly.
You know, it was a pentagram and a naked woman on the album cover. And there are like, I remember seeing somebody, this was a few years ago, I remember seeing somebody talk about this, that like between like 81 and 89, there were like hundreds of records that came out with pentagrams and naked women being sacrificed on the front cover. The weird thing that Christians did during this season was to say, it's all under the surface and you can't see it. And they're sneaking it into our kids. And so it was this idea that like, you've got Slayer and Pantera saying, you know, Pantera being cowboys from hell or whatever. I guess Pantera was later, but you've got all these metal bands that are doing all this stuff with the satanic imagery because they're just trying to push the boundary and be as extreme as possible or whatever. But then you have like, there's this sort of puritanical reaction that says, yeah. I mean, that stuff's bad. Keep it out of your house or whatever. But actually the thing you should really be worried about is the Smurfs,
right? Because
they're trying to normalize magic, you know, and if you normalize magic, et cetera, et cetera, there's this whole chain of events that people think will happen.
Okay, let's get back to the hucksters, the people who see this trend kind of slowly developing in the 1970s and recognize there's a market by the early 1980s. Mike Warnke is one of the guys that you highlight in one of the episodes. I didn't know him because he was, I think, big in the 70s, which was a little bit before I was.
Well, his heyday was the 80s, actually.
Was it really?
So, yeah.
I don't know why. I never encountered it. But he explained Mike Warnke and other people you would label as hucksters that utilize this trend to scare a lot of people and make a lot of money.
Yeah. So Warnke first arrives on the scene in 1970. I think his first kind of like real ministry experience was around 1971, 1972. And he, he kind of comes out of, at least sort of culturally, he comes out of the Jesus People movement. He's attached to some charismatic revivalist evangelist types in Southern California. And he's got this testimony. He's got this wild testimony about how he was involved in the Church of Satan, and he had a radical conversion. 1970, I believe it was 1973, he publishes his memoir, which is called The Satan Seller, in which he talks about how significant it was. You know, he was a high priest in the Church of Satan. He had sex slaves. He was a drug dealer. He, all this stuff. I mean, intense stuff. He was jet setting around the world with other rich and famous Satanists and involved in all this conspiratorial stuff and involved in child sacrifice and, witnessing all this horrible stuff. And, he puts the book out and the book does okay. But when he really explodes is actually 1976. 1976, he puts out his first comedy album. And from 76 to 1993... Because
that's what I would expect from a former Satanist to do stand-up. Yeah.
And the thing you got to see, the thing you got to understand about Warnke, like, Warnke is this, like, he looks kind of like Gallagher. Like, he's got this like goofy look about him. He wears these Coke bottle glasses. He's got the mullet. He dresses funky. And, what he does is he shares this crazy testimony, and he's very, like, he's funny. Like, he's not a great stand-up comedian, but he is a compelling character, and he's funny, and he gets a crowd going. But what he does, if you listen to the albums, like, what he does is this interesting thing where he kind of oscillates between this very vulnerable testimony of, man, Jesus can love me like he can love anybody, this radical testimony of the horrible things he saw and did as a Satanist, and then the comedy, the jokes, the funny stories, the things about his parents, the things about growing up. Like, he was good. He knew how to kind of work the angles on the thing. So he was the best-selling spoken word artist for Word Records in the period that he was out there, sold millions of records, unbelievable number of tickets. And, and then sort of outside of like the Christian subculture, he was a guy who would show up on Larry King whenever Satanism was in the news. He would show up on talk shows. Oprah had him on. Donahue had him on. Like he was a prominent cultural figure and treated as an expert on Satanism in the United States.
So he's kind of an evangelist for warning people about the reality and dangers of Satanism.
Exactly. And then in 1993, two journalists, Mike Hertenstein and John Trott, got a note from their editor at Cornerstone Magazine that said, hey, maybe it's time to look into the Warnke story. Because there had been rumors for years.
After 20 years, they're finally looking into the story. Maybe we should check this out. Okay.
Yeah, there had been rumors for a long time about his relationships with women, things happening on the road, alcohol consumption, like all these kinds of things that were just kind of like, what's really going on? He was raising all this money for, this like center for recovering Satanists in Wilmore, Kentucky. And they look into it and they're like, the story they published basically goes, so when it comes to evidence for him ever having been involved in Satanism whatsoever, it essentially boils down to, we think maybe he played with a Ouija board once his freshman year of college. And that's about as much as we've got, I mean, I'm not exaggerating. Like it's literally like, aside from that, there's basically no one who knew him at the time that would have ever said like he was a Satanist. And then when you go back and you listen to the story, it's like the thing I always laugh about is you listen to him tell his testimony from this period of time, and he'll say, yeah, I had hair down to the I had hair down to the middle of my back, and I'd grown my nails out 6 inches long and sharpened them for fighting. And I'm like, my reaction to that is that's a comment that someone who has never been in a fight before would ever. That's a lie that only someone who's never been in a fight before can ever make. 6-inch long nails for fighting? What is wrong with you? Like, are you crazy?
Okay, so that leads me to another level of this whole thing that we need to talk about. Someone like that comes along with this crazy story that, for whatever reason, and took 20 years for anybody to really investigate and look into. I have to think it's because as he went about telling this story, there were thousands, millions of people who simply wanted it to be true.
Exactly.
There was something about these stories, not just his, about all the Satanism, about the child abduction stories, the abuse, the cultic kind of stuff. Why do you think so many people in the church wanted these stories to be true to the point where they never even really investigated whether they were? What was it?
Yeah.
What was it offering to people or supplying to people that they were just ready to gobble up?
So what I think it actually boils down to is that what a moral panic actually does is provide a pressure release for our anxieties. So a parallel story, and this is something that we'll talk about later in the series, like in the next couple episodes, a parallel story to all of this is that there was kind of a faux pas on talking about child abuse for most of Western history until the 1960s. And then the 1960s, 1970s, there becomes this awareness of like, oh, there's this thing where kids are abused in homes and they're abused by their parents, right? And then in the 1980s, you start to find, because it becomes acceptable to like talk about domestic abuse, talk about child abuse, the discussions about sexual abuse really start to begin then for the first time. There's not a lot of discussion of child sexual abuse before then as a prominent phenomenon. And now these days we know that this happens a lot. So if you put yourself in the place of people in positions of power and influence, Christian leaders in positions of power and influence, and you start hearing, like, the zeitgeist is changing and you're hearing more about child sexual abuse than you've ever heard before in your life. what's easy, like what's easier to believe with your own conscience? Is it easier to believe that like I think it's something like 1 in 8 of the people in your pews or families in your pews have experienced some kind of sexual abuse in the home? Or is it easier to believe, no, it's an externalized problem. There's a cabal of Satanists. It's happening out there, and they are out to get your kids, and we have to figure out how to declare war on them and protect our kids, right? I think it's actually comforting in a very weird, convoluted way to be able to say the problems, the predatory behavior that's coming after our children is this evil cabal of Satanists that want to like sacrifice cats and drink their blood and do this other stuff and, torture our children while they're at it. Rather than like the much more uncomfortable thing, which is like most sexual abuse in the home happens because of stepfathers and, stepbrothers. And, it's often somebody whose neighbors would have said, "Oh, I never would have suspected it. He was a nice guy."
Yeah,
like that kind of thing.
I mean, you open the whole series with an examination of Josh Dugard from the famous Dugard family in Arkansas and all the, was it 19 kids and counting or something? And you look at Paul Pressler and Paige Patterson in the SBC, and in all these stories that we discover later, there was sexual abuse going on. These are communities or churches or families that made a big deal out of presenting the big bad culture. The evil that's out there is out to get us. All the while, the real evil was inside their own tent, but they weren't able to see it or wouldn't acknowledge it because they had an us versus them framing. Okay, before we wrap up, I want to talk about how this is still happening today. And not specifically the Satanic Panic, but it struck me.
I know where you're going.
Do you?
I do.
Okay, so one example, you have a fascinating investigation into the McMartin childcare thing. It's a horrible story in Southern California of all these childcare workers are accused of abusing children in satanic rituals, and it turns out there was zero evidence for any of this. And not too long ago, was it 2016, the Comet Ping Pong Pizza Gate thing, where people believe that Democrats were running a child sex trafficking ring out of the basement of a pizza shop in Washington, D.C. Yep. And a guy walks in with an assault rifle. Like these, it's amazing how these things are still happening. And if your hypothesis is correct, that we do this because it's easier to externalize the threats rather than deal with what's really going on in our own homes or communities or churches, how do you see that manifesting today? Because I don't see a lot of satanic panic, but I see a lot of other kinds of panic. And are they rooted in the same thing? And what do you identify?
Yeah, so it's so interesting. If you again look at the history of Western culture, and if you look at the history of Western culture, you see this theme emerge over and over again, which is this idea that like whoever they are, right? Whoever the villain in our story is, they're coming after our children.
Right.
Just before the Satanic Panic, one of the things we highlight in the series is this moment in the late 1970s in Miami, Florida, when the city of Miami passed a law that said that you couldn't discriminate. Particularly, like the primary emphasis in the law was you couldn't discriminate on housing against people because of their sexual orientation. It was housing, and there were some employment requirements there, but like there were some caveats to the employment thing where small business owners and stuff would have had an out to not hire homosexuals if they didn't want to, and it resulted in this massive backlash. Led by a woman named Anita Bryant, and her campaign against this law, which again, the law was about if a gay person wants to rent your duplex, you have to, you can't say no because they're gay.
Right.
Her campaign, the title of her campaign was Save Our Children, right? So there's this impulse to go, There's a cultural issue. Let's bring the kids into it and make the kids the center of the argument. Go back to the Middle Ages. I mean, the blood libel of the Middle Ages was this idea that whatever was going on with, whether it was the plague or whether it was, economic stress in the Middle Ages, whenever something troublesome happens in the Middle Ages, all of a sudden there's pogroms against Jews. Why? Because Jews are kidnapping children, killing them, draining them of blood, and baking the blood into their matzah for their Shabbat dinners or their Seder, or whatever it is. So there's just it's almost like that. It's like a template that we resurrect over and over again. Yeah. Whenever we want to really demonize somebody in our society, what we do is we say, oh yeah, they're awful. And by the way, they're targeting your kids.
Yeah. Right? But I think here's the difference though. Like, gay people are real. They exist. Jews are real. They exist. I think you could make a case that the Satanic Panic in the 80s and 90s is now turned into sort of the Hispanic Panic, where it's immigrants who are going to, kill your children and eat your pets and all that kind of craziness. And like Democrats, they exist, and they're now apparently child pedophiles and running sex rings out of pizza shops, and they're full of demons. Back in the 1980s and 90s, when I was a kid, the whole fear was around Satanists, but no one actually knew a Satanist. And as the evidence showed, I mean, maybe there's a handful of people out there who are true Satanists, but they're not out there. They're not in our schools and our grocery stores, even though they thought everyone around every corner was a Satanist. But
the actual Church of Satan was jumping in constantly to go, this is not what we do.
Right. But I'm not saying there's not a significant segment of Satan worshipers in America. Right. The way we actually have neighbors, friends, family members, and loved ones who are gay or Hispanic or a Democrat or whatever. So we're actually harming significant communities by demonizing them today in a way that you could argue we weren't doing great damage to the massive minority of Satanists out there. So that's what troubles me about where we're at. And I wonder if you have any thoughts as to why the Satanic Panic kind of faded or maybe ended by 1993. And did Democrats kind of take over that role? Or did Muslims take over that role after 9/11? Was it some other?
No, they were always the target. So part, like, what I would say is, if you go back and you look to kind of the substance of what was happening with the culture war at the time, the people that were leveraging the panic were people like the Jerry Falwells, the Ralph Reeds, the folks that were working very hard at that moment to really marry the GOP to the evangelical movement. And the reason entertainment comes up over and over again is because entertainment's liberal, right? Hollywood's a bunch of liberals. So if you can demonize, it was sort of this interesting, and I want to be very careful about how I describe this. I don't think it was a conspiracy where like Falwell and Warnke and whoever else were sitting around in a room going, how do we pull this thing off? I think it was sort of it was more like a conspiracy of convenience, where it's like, well, they're doing that over there, I'm going to do this over here.
Yeah, if people are worried about Satanists coming after their children, and we want them to be worried about Democrats or liberals in Hollywood or LGBTQ folks, well, we're going to import that demonic language and put it on these other groups.
And so it's like, if Warnke's over here telling you that Satanists are targeting your kids, and they're doing this, that, and the other, and then someone else is over here saying, and by the way, like the Black Cauldron and the Sword and the Stone and Dungeons and Dragons and the Smurfs, like these are all sort of laying the groundwork to seduce your kids into this idea of magic and black magic, and it leads you over here. And then, you kind of follow that chain of events. Then you also get people inside pop culture. You get the rock acts and others who just sort of lean into it as like you know, I mean, maybe some of the satanic rock bands from the 1980s were serious about it, but most of it were just sort of leaning into it like a meme. It was it was Flannery O'Connor, like particularly somebody like an Alice Cooper, who's a devout Christian. Cooper was leaning into it as the grotesque. Like, let's just sort of display, you know, the dark side of the world, the dark side of humanity.
And it felt like to me too,
manipulated. Some
of these groups knew that their audience are teenagers, and teenage rebellion was a way to reach them. And if every mom in America is scared of satanic symbolism and ideas, well, we're going to put that front and center, because the kids who want to rebel against their parents, they're going to come to our stuff. And it just all feeds us. Okay. Last thing. You mentioned how people wanted it to be true because it made the evil something out there rather than something they had to look at in their own communities or even in their own souls. How do you see that playing out right now? What is the current satanic panic, and what function is it serving for evangelicals or Christians today? Is it the same?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is I think that among evangelicals, there are several places where folks are trying to sort of mainstream a similar kind of anxiety. I think the immigrant thing is one of them. And I think the other part of it is like, no, I want to be careful here. Because at the end of the day, I am a conservative evangelical. Like, I don't apologize for the fact that I still think Charles Krauthammer and William F. Buckley were mostly right about everything they ever said, right? So I'm still a conservative, and I still want to advocate for cultural conservatism and all that. However, I'll say this: I think we saw a lot of progressive overreach in the last few years, and like the trans athletes in sports was one of those areas where there was some obvious progressive overreach. Then you get the amplification of the overreach into these stories of like how, well, you know, in high schools in Michigan, they have to put a litter box in the back of the room because kids that are trans feline are, you know, think they're cats and have to pee in the corner in the middle of class or whatever. Like, as if you couldn't put the litter box in the bathroom if you really had to have one. Like, that's one of the, I mean, cats go to the basement, man. Like, why couldn't the kid go to the bathroom? Anyway, that's the kind of stuff where I feel like it's not hard to find that kind of anxiety and that kind of overreach showing up again and again and again in our culture. And so it comes back to this thing where it's like, the story is too good to question. Mike Warnke's story was too good to question. We didn't get into her story, but Lauren Stratford is another one. It was too good to question. We wanted to believe it. And in Lauren Stratford's case, everybody who was close to her was like, I can't believe anybody's giving this woman a microphone because she's crazy, because anybody who knew her knew she was crazy. So, but when the story is too good to doubt, you just want to amplify it because you know it's going to outrage people and motivate them and move them in certain directions. I think that's why Warnke has so much success, and I think that I think that today that operates on a number of different levels.
For sure.
And,
I mean, I think that captures it. There are stories that are too good to question, or they're too convenient to question. Like, we can utilize a story. I think the Stop the Steal stuff was wrapped up in a lot of that. For some people, it was QAnon. But if it serves a function in your community or for your tribe, don't question it. It's useful.
Yeah.
And it makes us really foolish and unwise and blind to the problems in our own community because we're so fixated on the evil out there.
And they never hold up to scrutiny. They never do. I mean, that's one of the things that's so interesting about this is like, yeah, it took 20 years for things to catch up to Warnke, but that was not the internet age.
Right.
Like, if Warnke had tried to do that in the internet age, like, look at what happened to John Crist. That didn't take that long to catch up to John Crist. Now, he's back. He's doing his thing, whatever. But again, like, it's not going to, anyway, with Warnke, it would not have lasted very long. With Stratford, there's no way that she could have gotten away with what she did.
Yeah, but see, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure, because as much as the internet expedites the uncovery of fraud, it also insulates people into algorithmic silos where they can continue to believe the nonsense and get it reinforced by the people who are there. I mean, it might have taken Warnke down a lot quicker, and he probably would have recovered a lot quicker and found another willing audience that said it was all conspiracy. They were out to get me. The Satanists have taken over, whatever. So it's kind of the best of times. It's the worst of times on this stuff. But Mike, thank you for the great work you're doing at CT and this new series. Again, it's Devil in the Deep Blue Sea. If you guys haven't seen it yet, if you haven't listened, you got to tune in, especially if you were a kid in the 80s or 90s, because it's so fascinating to find out what was really going on behind all those arguments that people were having in youth groups and with parents. So, Mike, thanks for being with us.
Man, my pleasure. Good to see you again.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Holy Post Media, produced by Mike Strelo, editing by Seth Gorvet. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much, much more.